Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to reintroduce to you now. Cynthia Thurlow is a returning guest on our show. Be sure to check out her first appearances on episode 116 and 246 of Boundless Body Radio. Cynthia Thurlow is a nurse practitioner, host of the Everyday Wellness podcast, author, and international speaker with over 15 million views for her second TED Talk titled Intermittent Fasting, Transformational Technique. With over 25 years of experience in health and wellness, Cynthia is a globally recognized expert in perimenopause, menopause, and intermittent fasting, and has been featured on ABC, Fox 5, KTLA, CW, Medium, Entrepreneur, and the Megyn Kelly Show. Her mission is to empower women to live their most optimal lives in perimenopause and beyond. When Cynthia Thurlow was pushed to examine a personal health crisis, she discovered an unexpected culprit behind her vulnerability, which was perimenopause. In her new book, The Menopause Gut, Balance Your Microbiome to Reclaim Your Health in Midlife and Beyond, Thurlow offers a roadmap to reclaim balance and immune resistance after menopause. Cynthia Thurlow, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
Thanks, Casey. So looking forward to having this conversation today.
I am very much looking forward to this conversation as well. Always have a great time chatting with you. Congratulations on the podcast. That is absolutely amazing. It's one that I still enjoy listening to. You are a tremendous host. I think you ask amazing questions. And also your solo episodes are so good. The kind of new series that you've been doing, where you call it a minute, it kind of gets up into 20 or 30 minutes. I appreciate it. There's no way I could do that type of monologuing and keep it interesting and amazing the way you do. You're just an amazing host.
Thank you. I take that, I receive that wonderful compliment. And I tell everyone that podcasting is my favorite thing I do in my business. I think that as an introvert, I love asking people questions. So it's like, it just gives me an opportunity to ask all the questions that I'm sure listeners are dying to ask the same like expert.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. I'm glad you said that about your favorite part of the business. It is for me as well, one of my favorite things, but that doesn't discount the fact that it is a lot of work. When you're trying to find guests, prepare, try to create unique episodes that have not been done before. I mean, I remember one of my very early episodes with Dr. Sean Baker. I had him on and hung up the phone with him afterwards and realized I'd asked him all the same questions that everybody else asked him, and we didn't create anything new or special. And you're able to do that, and that is a lot of work. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I think it's like I think interviewing is a talent that we can hone just like any other skill. And remember, as a healthcare provider, like I'm used to asking patients questions. It's like over iterating on similar questions that I ask patients all the time. And so for me, I think that helped me fine tune those skills, but it's a skill that any podcaster can continue to refine and figure out like what angle they want to ask people about. And I think when you have a gracious guest like Sean, he probably doesn't mind being asked similar questions because, ultimately he just wants to get good information out there. And that's what your ideal guest wants to do is just ensure that the information they're sharing is helpful, beneficial, fairly objective, we hope. And, ultimately gets listeners to be curious, like curious about their bodies or nutrition or any other lifestyle measure that can make a big impact in their health.
It certainly does. And yeah, like I said, your show always teaches me something new and helps me consider things a little bit differently, which I really appreciate. We're going to talk about that. You have a personal story that led up to this book that I would love to get to. Your kind of initial foray after you had practiced medicine for so long was kind of in the intermittent fasting world. And of course, fasting is an amazing tool. We learn new things about it. And when you first started talking about it, surely your opinion has changed on certain aspects of intermittent fasting. And so this is going to be an extremely generalized question. Fasting is very individualized. So just generally speaking, in what ways has your thinking evolved when it comes to intermittent fasting?
Well, I think that there was a story worth sharing with your community. So in 2024, my dad had a series of falls and got very sick. And my brother and I decided with his decisions that he was very clear about, he didn't want to have surgical intervention for a head bleed. And so we allowed him to pass in hospice, which is what he wanted. We were honoring what he wanted. But seeing how frail my dad became the last 5 or so years of his life really left me with an indelible impression. Number one, I look like my dad's kid. I have a similar body habitus. We're both kind of thin and lean and tend to be that way. And, watching my dad's health decline really forced me to examine the fact that if I didn't live differently, the second half of my life, I could potentially end up just like him. And I didn't want that burden for my children because it's arduous. It's awful watching your parents' health decline and ultimately having them die. But it left me with such an indelible impression because I realized that I had to get really serious about strength training. And let me be clear, I've always been good about exercising, but I needed to be more diligent about pushing myself with weights. And so when I made that decision to get really granular and serious about strength training, I also had to get really granular and serious about my nutrition. And it wasn't that I wasn't eating healthy or that I wasn't eating the right foods. I was probably not eating enough. It's really hard to build muscle in middle age unless you are really optimizing your nutrition. You're getting really serious about recovery. You get very diligent about progressive overload with weight training. And so I hired a personal trainer to kick my butt. I started eating in a 12 to 13 hour period of digestive or outside of this digestive rest concept. So instead of calling it intermittent fasting, which 12 to 13 hours is literally just 12 to 13 hours without eating, um, I started abiding by 3 meals a day instead of two. And I started to find that my body composition, meaning I was developing more lean muscle mass and losing a little bit of body fat, came to fruition. So for me personally, I still believe in intermittent fasting as a strategy. However, dovetail, if you are trying to build muscle, you need to get really clear about, are you eating enough food to actually be able to do that? Because when I got really clear about my macros, I was like, yeah, I'm getting close to 100 grams a day of protein, but I'm eating it in 2 meals and then I'm not hungry for a third. So how can I readjust my meals so that I can get 120 grams of protein? And I need to spread that out over 3 meals and not two. And so now I have 3 boluses of protein a day. I've gotten really granular about the rest of my macros, but that has allowed me to put muscle mass on. And muscle mass is not impossible to build in middle age, but as a female in menopause, it gets a whole lot more challenging. And even though I take hormone replacement therapy, I sleep well, I do all the right things, I get plenty of recovery, it's a little harder at this stage of the game. And so that nutrition piece and meal frequency became really important. Now, I want to be clear, I still believe in intermittent fasting. I think, especially for those of us that are not metabolically healthy, people that are trying to shift body composition, but it shouldn't be at the expense of losing muscle because muscle is way more than just a physical aspect of our bodies. It really is a metabolic engine. It's really important for insulin sensitivity. It's important to maintain it so that you don't become frail and then fall. And I think people, Casey, and our age ranges aren't thinking about frailty. They're like, that's so far in the future. I don't need to think about it. I think about it a whole lot more now, having gone through that experience in 2024 with my dad, even though I had seen plenty of patients become sarcopenic, weak, and frail and lead to falls. But there's somehow seeing it through the lens of a daughter watching their father's health decline so rapidly, for me, really left me with this indelible impression. And so I try to help educate people to say, listen, if you're a lean female and you're still getting a menstrual cycle, please do not go overboard with intermittent fasting. However, if you are PCOS, insulin resistant, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or you've got any other PCOS, any of these metabolic diseases, or even high blood pressure, please, please, please consider that intermittent fasting might be something for you to do around your menstrual cycle. And same thing with men. Like my husband, fasts a couple days a week and he doesn't need to fast every single day. But I think it is still a really valuable strategy for people. Maybe you do it when you travel. Maybe you do it when you've come back from vacation, you've eaten too much food. But I think for a lot of people, it's like get really clear about your nutrition and whether or not you're nourishing your body. Because I think for some people, they're unknowingly, chronically eating they're just in a deficit all the time. And that makes it hard to recover. It makes it hard to build muscle, makes it hard to sleep. I mean, there's so many things that come from that.
Yeah, well, that's very well explained. I'm of the habit of telling people that when they're in the fasted state, generally speaking, the body will protect its muscle mass. But what you're talking about is just being a little bit more clear about
Mhm.
getting those protein goals to actually have a little bit of growth. You need a little bit extra in those times, and maybe fasting, you might not be wasting muscle per se, but if you want to be gaining and preparing for the future, you need to be a little bit more diligent today.
Yeah,
Am
and
I
it's fun.
understanding that right?
Yes, and it's interesting because you talk to other experts in the space, metabolic health experts, and they'll talk about that caution. If you are a thin, lean person, think about it. Your body can become catabolic. And so we use that term to talk about how muscle can be broken down to fuel the body. And you just never want to get to that point where you're chronically in a state of catabolism. And so when people are like fasting habitually, every single week, 20, 24-hour fasts, I'm like, do you really need to do that at the expense of your muscle mass?
Well said. Well, thank you for that. I love getting updates on how people are changing and evolving their thinking around things. So I really appreciate that. Your book, you just wrote the menopausal gut, excuse me.
It's okay.
Amazing book. Thank you so much for sending it. I really enjoyed reading it. You're very clear on a lot of things. I just want to know your own personal story that led to deciding that this book needed to be written.
Yeah, well, it's funny how life kind of imitates art. So in 2018, I took this romantic trip with my husband. We went to Morocco and then went from Morocco, went to Spain. And in Morocco, we ate the same food, but one of us got food poisoning, deathly ill, and the other one didn't. And the most important thing is we ate the same foods. My husband's only 2 years older than me. He had no problems, no symptoms. I got really, really sick. And then several months later, ended up in the hospital for a 13-day hospitalization, which we believe may have been exacerbated by a friend I picked up in Morocco called Giardia. But I think, you're getting to the point, what was the actual impetus for writing the book? And that would be, I have a podcast and I get to interview all these experts and researchers and medical professionals. And there were some common themes that were being shared. And I was seeing common themes on lab work for my female patients. And I started to kind of synthesize in my head that there's some things we're not talking about. We recognize that bone changes in menopause and perimenopause and menopause are risk for heart disease, brain health can change. Everything in our bodies can change in the absence of hormones where they were before. But no one's talking about the gut microbiome. And so I started to synthesize a lot of these conversations and actually pitched my editor who said, do you think you have another book in you? And I was like, yeah, I think I do. And so I gave her the idea and I said, let's talk about the gut microbiome because literally, and this is the same for men too. I mean, the gut intersects with every single organ system in the body. It sends out signaling molecules to communicate, kind of like a postal service. And so from there, I pitched the book idea because I felt like it was important for women to better understand what's changing in their physiology as they're getting older and what can they do to help support it so that, they're more aware. And I jokingly say, perimenopause and menopause is more than slapping on an estrogen patch and taking some oral progesterone. There's so much more to this nuanced conversation. So to your point, that romantic trip in 2018 started to kind of sew together the idea of writing a book on the gut. And then all of the conversations on the podcast and patients I've been treating, just for me, kind of affirmed there were some definitive patterns that I was seeing, but I had to kind of synthesize all the research and talk about it in a way that people can read the book, they'll get a lot of good information, but there's a lot of how-tos. And I think that's what I personally like when I'm reading books is, give me all the information, but then teach me how to support my gut in a way that doesn't feel arduous and overwhelming.
Yeah, I like how the book is laid out that way. The part one, all about what's going on. Part two, what to do about it. So I think that flows really, really well. What are some of the major issues that we're seeing with gut health, is specifically with menopause? Like women's health and hormones is definitely not my area of expertise. So I'm going to ask a lot of ignorant questions. I apologize in advance for that. But I know that when somebody's going through menopause, people can have more gut issues, but I wouldn't necessarily have connected those two things as being like major, major issues. So tell us, as a woman's body is changing, hormones are changing, why specifically the gut? You just talked about like how important it is, of course, the gut-brain connection and all that other stuff, but what is it specifically about gut health and menopause, and what is causing all the problems?
Well, I would say first and foremost, Casey, I love your interest in this topic because I remind people that, when men are having conversations with me, it's because they want to better understand, maybe not where their spouse is right now, but better understand like what's to come. And so, when you're asking these questions, there are no ignorant questions. It's more clarification about how to make the information more accessible. So when I think about what's changing the gut microbiome, let's back up and let's at least define what it is. Because I think most people know what a heart and where your heart is, where your lungs are, where your brain is, I hope. I think people understand where their stomach is, plus or minus maybe their small intestine or large intestine. But when we talk about the gut microbiome, we're speaking about 40 trillion bacteria, viruses, fungi, and protozoa, that there are more of them than there are of us, human cells. And it's housed in our large intestine or colon. And what starts to change as we see a decline in progesterone first, that's what happens in perimenopause, and then ultimately estradiol, plus or minus a little bit of testosterone, we start seeing changes in keystone bacteria. Why is that important? Because these are beneficial bacteria that are part of the community of organisms that our body interfaces with. We see more inflammation. So people use the term inflammaging. It's because as we are getting older, our immune system actually ages along with us. We see a reduction in short chain fatty acids, which I'm sure we probably will touch on, but they're essentially signaling molecules in the body. We also see more opportunistic infections, more leaky gut. I think everyone in your community has probably heard of leaky gut. If you've got a leaky gut, you probably have had an autoimmune condition. And then it's this domino effect. So as hormones are declining, it makes us more likely to have more symptoms, more mood disorders, whether it's more anxiety, more depression. We may have more bloating, constipation, joint pain, brain fog. I mean, the list goes on and on. But what's interesting is when we think about the microbiome, I think people, when they think about their digestive system, they're like, oh, it's just for absorbing nutrients. And I'm like, oh, it's so much more than that. We detoxify there. The liver is the main site of detoxification in the body. There's something called the estrobolome, which is an area in the microbiome where we process and package up estrogen and hopefully poop it out. But all those things start to change as we are navigating this middle-age timeframe. And many of the symptoms that I mentioned, women just assume are normal at this stage of life. And I think bloating is probably the most common thing women experience. But by understanding what's happening, there are things we can do, like easy things that we can do that can support our bodies before we even get to the hormone discussion, which I think is also very important.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I want to talk about that as well. Talking about this woman, this woman that you're giving an example, all of these different symptoms. What can she expect if she goes to the conventional medical system that you were once a part of?
Yeah, well, I mean, it probably depends on the healthcare provider that they're seeing. Sometimes they only get 10 or 15 minutes with a patient, so they might get one diagnosis. I'm bloated. Okay, well, they may walk away and say, okay, well, is it reflux? Is it because you are, we use the term dyspepsia, which just means gastric irritation? Are you not having bowel movements every day? So they may give you something to address some reflux. They may tell you to eat more slowly. They may tell you, take this fiber supplement and try to go to the bathroom every day. So it probably will get to a point where they will treat it on a very superficial level, which is completely appropriate. But they may not dig a little deeper. Like when a woman comes to me with bloating, first thing I'm asking is, what are you doing before you eat a meal? Are you eating in the car? Are you eating on the go? Are you eating while you're feeding your kids? Are you stressed out while you're trying to eat? Which, thinking about digestion as a north to south process, digestion starts in our brain. So if you are stressed, you are not going to be able to break down and absorb nutrients. Your body's going to struggle more with detoxification, which is not a program in a box. Let me be clear. The health and wellness industry really does a crummy job explaining things to people about detoxification. But we'll take it through. Do we need to look at underlying food sensitivities? Is there something going on with the gut in terms of do you have an opportunistic infection? H. pylori is common. Dysbiosis is common. Other opportunistic infections, and it can, go all the way to infections with Candida or even SIBO, which is small intestinal bacteria overgrowth, which never occurs quickly. That's a process over time. Or are you bloated because you don't poop every day? I mean, it can be that granular of a conversation. So I think for a lot of women, it's really getting a good history, which not every healthcare provider has 15 to 30 minutes with their patients to really get a good history. But more often than not, as I tell students, the bulk of the information you need is not in that lab work. It's actually when you're having a conversation with your patient. So working with someone that's going to be able to take extra time with you to be able to kind of tease out what could be contributing to your symptoms is really important.
Okay, got it. It just seems like this is a perfect opportunity for gaslight city for a lot of women out there.
Potentially, absolutely. I mean, how many women? I mean, I think about, after I came back from Morocco, I had gas and bloating for a long time, even after that hospitalization. Ultimately, I got diagnosed with SIBO, but I knew I had SIBO because in the morning I looked like I had a flat stomach, and by 6 or 7 o'clock at night, it looked like I was 6 months pregnant. And that was a consistent pattern over time. So I think for a lot of women, it's Finding the right provider that's going to be able to listen. It doesn't mean that every single person listening has to have a functional integrative provider. They just need someone who cares and has the time to actually tease through all those questions. And if anyone that does international travel, you better believe sometimes you come home with little friends. It's happened to me more than once.
Yeah, wow. Okay. Going back to the microbiome, I wanted to ask you, where are we as far as our knowledge about the microbiome? You hear that it's in the infancy. There's did you say 40 trillion
40
bacteria?
trillion
That's
with a T.
incredible.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
absolutely
So I
incredible.
would say I would say the last 5, 10 years, it's been a really burgeoning, emerging field. What's exciting is that we're starting to better understand the influence of hormones, like especially as hormones are declining for women, but men also go through andropause. It's not nearly as dramatic as what women go through, but the influence of every single body system, like, would you know that the health of our gut is intricately tied to our bones? And vice versa, that leaky gut can lead to leaky bones and can lead to leaky brain. So I remind people that there's not an organ system in our body that's not connected to the gut microbiome. For women, our ovaries are the pacemaker of aging for our bodies, just like the testes are for men. And I remind women all the time that ovarian health is intricately interrelated with the gut microbiome too. So if you are smoking and drinking with reckless abandon, or if you're not addressing underlying chronic stress, those things can age you faster than we ever thought possible before. So, to your point, I think a lot of people, because the gut is not as tangible as like the hearts or the lung or the brain, a lot of people don't give it a lot of credence. But I'm here to tell you, it's like a little mini city inside our bodies. It's pretty incredible.
Wow. And you mentioned, did you call them keystone microbiomes? Or, I'm sorry,
Keystone.
keystone
Yep.
bacteria.
Yeah.
So
So there's
we've identified ones that we know for sure are healthy for us.
Yeah, so things like Akkermansia muciniphila, which with that name, it's like mucus producing, and so it helps produce mucus that protects the one cell layer thick of the small intestine. Also important for endogenous GLP-1 production. So the GLP-1 meds are very popular right now. Probably the most revolutionary drug in my lifetime. It is really incredible what we're starting to learn, but it's helpful for that particular bacteria species is important for our bodies being able to create it on its own. So we use the term endogenous, meaning inside the body. Also really important for short chain fatty acid production. And short chain fatty acids, just to give your listeners a perspective, it's signaling molecules. So it's like an information, it's like a postal service. They're important for transferring and sending information throughout the body, which is pretty cool.
That is absolutely amazing. Yeah, can you go into a little bit more detail about the gut bone connection? You wrote an entire chapter about that. I found that absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, so just to kind of back up and say that this gut bone axis is really important, and I mean the same applies to men as well. They have a gut bone axis as well, but a lot of things influence the health of a woman's gut bone axis. Things like choice of contraception. So this is not a political statement, and I'm all about women having choice about when and if they choose to have children. But starting oral contraceptives or even using Depo-Provera at very young ages can blunt the peak bone and muscle mass of women. And really, it's mostly bone mass. So when you're kept in a low estrogen state, like you are when you're on contraceptives, which is one of the things that helps prevent pregnancy, that also means you can't build bone. It's almost like you're in a premenopausal state where your estrogen levels are really low. And so, it seems to be most impactful on younger women, meaning teens and very young adults. So if you start oral contraceptives on a 40-year-old, it's not going to impact their bone health like it does when they're younger. And so when I think about the things that, and I wasn't prescribing oral contraceptives, so I'm going to just say that these are things that I now understand should be part of fully informed consent. So if there's a listener who has a daughter or a loved one on oral contraceptives or Depo-Provera, I'm all for women having reproductive choice, but understanding that Depo-Provera, as an example, has a black box warning, and that is because it is so impactful on bone health. The research suggests after a 2-year period, it is reversible. But that being said, I was interacting with someone today who had been on Depo for 10 years, and we don't know what the net impact will be on bone mass. So part of informed consent when those drugs are being prescribed needs to be, hey, we don't fully appreciate or yet know what the long-term effects are on bone if we keep your estrogen levels really, really low, which is why, I mean, this is sad. A lot of women on oral contraceptives don't have a libido, and that's because their sex hormones are so blunted. The irony being now they're protected from pregnancy for the most part, but now they don't have a sex drive. So that's the irony of these drugs. But those are the two things that I think a great deal about. But what's interesting is life kind of comes full circle. So women in perimenopause and menopause, when we're looking at bone health, we're looking at, can we balance bone build up with bone build down? Bone building is by osteoblasts, B as in blast, but that's estrogen's job. And then bone breakdown is progesterone's job, and that's osteoclasts. And so they work together, kind of like a symphony. When we go into menopause, the bone breakdown starts to accelerate. So you aren't building as much bone, but you're breaking more bone down. And that's where you can get into trouble because if the gut bone axis isn't healthy, either because you have leaky gut and you have an autoimmune condition, or you have a blunting of short chain fatty acids, which are important for helping to buffer that bone breakdown. They're really important for that osteoclastic activity. You can get an upregulation of more bone loss. So when women tell me they're osteopenic or osteoporotic, obviously osteopenia is truly not like a real diagnosis. It's more of an it's like observational data, just saying like your bone is not as strong as it once was. But many women who've been on the pill for 20 plus years, they may never have hit peak bone mass because they were kept in a low estrogen state. So when you're looking at women, it's like not waiting until they're 65 to look at their bone through a DEXA or a REMS. It's testing women at 25. It's testing women if they choose to breastfeed because we get more bone breakdown while we're breastfeeding. And it's testing before women go into menopause. So we know what our baseline is. So bone health goes along intricately with gut health. So the things that are harmful for gut health are the same things that are harmful for bone health. So like smoking, excessive alcohol use, standard American diet, toxins that we're exposed to, but then plus or minus, chronic antibiotic use, long-term oral contraceptive use. We're not sure how much that affects bone health over time. But I think it's important, and I say this to your listeners, because everyone listening should have a baseline assessment of their bone health way before 65. Unfortunately, the standard guidelines are 65. And I find for a lot of women, if they go into menopause at 50, they're 15 years into menopause. And it's like, sometimes they don't know they're osteoporotic until they fall and have we call it a fragility fracture. So like a hip fracture, a wrist fracture, those fractures that happen because someone trips and breaks a bone. Sometimes that's the only time they find out that they're osteoporotic. And by then it's almost a little too late. There are medications that you can use, but we know right now that estradiol is a great way to prevent osteoporosis. And that's a big message. Like, this is a drug that we know, proven in studies, can help support bone loss so that you're, remember I mentioned estrogen and progesterone are designed to be in a symphony. When the symphony goes off cue in menopause, adding in an estradiol patch can help bolster your estrogen levels to keep your bone build up, steadying with that bone breakdown.
Cynthia, that was so well explained. That's the first time that's ever made any sense to me. That was
Oh, thank you.
amazingly explained. Thank you very much. No, that makes a ton of sense. So you did casually mention it, and I just want to make sure we highlight the point. We can probably assume that a really big offender in the digestive system is going to be the foods that we eat. You mentioned the standard American diet. In your opinion, what are the most, devastating, harmful things that we can be eating?
I would say, first and foremost, sugar. I think sugar would come before, emulsifiers and additives. I think poor quality oils. I think that we have to differentiate, a cold pressed oil that's on your shelf in your pantry versus the stuff that is heated over and over and over again, like specific types of seed oils that are used in the processed food industry that we know become very inflammatory and rancid and just overall not healthy for us. So sugar's number one because it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. I mean, it is in everything. I don't care if you buy the cleanest salad dressing or the cleanest ketchup. Almost all of them have sugar in them. And we've gotten so sensitized to it that we don't even notice. So sugar's number one, additives, emulsifiers, and gums, because we don't even know what that is. It's like Frankenfood. Poor quality fats would definitely come. I mean, I think eating food that's less processed, so things that aren't in a box, a bag, or a can, I think is ultimately the direction we want to go in. And I think most other things I can work around, meaning I don't care if people have a sweet potato, and I'm certainly not going to tell people how much carbohydrate they need to be eating. But if you eat less processed carbohydrates, I don't care if it's lentils or beans or sweet potato or root veggies or low glycemic berries or, green leafy vegetables. Those are going to be better alternatives to like bread and pasta and, highly hyper processed other carbohydrates. And so, fats are certainly looking at the quality of your fats, looking at the quality of your protein is all really important. I used to get a little more hung up on, buy wild caught, grass fed. Now I'm like, listen, I just want you to eat the protein. Like if you can get the protein in, I don't care if it's in a can of tuna fish or you buy, the bag of relatively inexpensive shrimp at Costco. I'm less concerned about that because I think that we've gotten to a point where we've gotten so rigidly dogmatic about nutrition that we're missing the point. Like buy the best quality food that your budget permits, period. Like don't be, sometimes the influencers on social media I know are well-meaning, or at least I'd like to think they are, but sometimes people are so fear-mongered they cannot make decisions. And we don't want to put things in a position where people no longer feel comfortable being able to go to the grocery store and pick food out for themselves. I think we have largely let the processed food industry dictate for us about what we want to be eating, meaning the hyper processed, delectable, bliss point laden foods that make it really hard to like push your plate away and step away from the table. And so, when I round out the things that I'm most concerned about, those are my tops, but I would also mention alcohol because the research is certainly evolving now to suggest that no amount of alcohol is healthy. That doesn't mean that if you're listening, if you have alcohol on a celebration, graduation, birthday, that's different. But if you're drinking half a bottle of wine or more a night, if you're having, multiple mixed drinks every night, you really need to be looking at probably your coping mechanisms. And I say that lovingly. Because for a lot of people, that's their release valve. When my kids were younger, the mommy drinking culture was really, really prevalent. And anytime I would go to mom group meeting in my neighborhood, I was sometimes shocked at the amount of alcohol that women drank in the sense that they were drinking like we did in college. But they were, these are 35, 40-year-old women who felt like they didn't have a release valve during the day with their kids, being home with their kids. And because of the kind of work that I did, I couldn't go to work with a hangover. I mean, that was never an option when you work in medicine. You have to have all your mental faculties like really dialed in. And it was just really interesting from an observational perspective. So I would say alcohol is also part of that limit and or eliminate. For some people, that is very triggering to hear that. But the research certainly suggests no amount of alcohol is actually beneficial. We know the long-term effects on breast health for women. Not to mention, if you're taking hormone replacement therapy, it will raise your estrogen levels fourfold for amount of hours afterwards. Not to mention all the people with colorectal issues we're starting to see more and more research coming out supporting that the benefits just aren't there. If you're going to do it, doing sparingly, don't do it excessively, and try to limit how much you consume.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for all of that. I really appreciate it. We've kind of gone through some of the topics in the first part of your book. Let's talk about the fixes, starting with nutrition. We just kind of talked about some of the things that probably need to go to be reduced or removed, like you said. What are some of the things we want to be replacing that with?
Yeah, I would say, number one is protein. This is for men and women. We know there's something called the protein leverage hypothesis. Let me be really clear. My 18 and 20-year-old sons who are very athletic can probably trigger muscle protein synthesis with 10 or 15 grams of protein. As we get older, we start buffering up against anabolic resistance. And so we need more protein, not less. So no less than 30 to 50 grams per meal. The next thing that I think is really important, and this is for men as well, is fiber intake. I know fiber is very controversial. In fact, I call it the new F word. It is, in fact, so controversial. But as short chain fatty acid production is declining, it becomes more and more important for us to consume fiber. And let me explain why fiber is so important. So when we consume fiber, it goes through our digestive system, gets to the large intestine or colon, and there we have colonocytes that actually help ferment the fiber. And from that, we develop these short chain fatty acids. They're signaling molecules. Remember I mentioned earlier, they're like a postal service in the body. They're really, really important. And one of them in particular is called butyrate. It can actually cross the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is designed to be impermeable, which means ideally we don't want it to be leaky. We don't want things, it's designed to protect the brain. but butyrate can cross the blood-brain barrier, and it's really important for brain health. The other thing is short chain fatty acids are very anti-inflammatory. I probably mentioned earlier that in middle age and beyond, in the setting of less estradiol, we become more inflamed with less insulin sensitivity. We become more inflammatory. They're very important for kind of reducing inflammation in the body. They're also intricately involved in endogenous GLP-1 regulation along with akkermansia. There's a lot, they're important for that mucin lining of the small intestine. Remember, I mentioned it's one cell layer thick. But as we have less and less short chain fatty acids, that becomes problematic. And one of the ways we can bolster that is with fiber. Fiber is very bio-individual. I want to be really clear. Casey, what you tolerate may not be what I tolerate, and vice versa. So I always remind women in particular that there's a degree of experimentation because there's different kinds of fiber. There's soluble, insoluble, there's fermentable carbs or fiber. There's all sorts of options. So it's finding a couple that work well for you and then figuring out how much you're consuming on a daily basis and then increasing it a little bit. The standard guidelines say anywhere from 25 to 30 grams per day. Average American's probably consuming 5 to 10. Why is this important? Because we're starting to see rises in colorectal cancer. And all of the experts I've spoken to on the podcast have certainly suggested one of the causative reasons may be this significant reduction in fiber intake. Now, there's probably someone listening that's like, I don't tolerate any fiber. Well, guess what? In 2019, after spending 13 days in the hospital and 6 weeks on antibiotics, neither did I for a long time. I think when someone does not tolerate fiber, it might be quantity, it might be the type of fiber they're consuming, and or I look at it as a litmus test on the health of the gut microbiome, because what I could tolerate in 2020 is way different than what I can tolerate in 2026. And I very transparently have shared with my crappy genetics with colorectal polyps. I've had to get colonoscopies every 5 years for the last 20 years. And I had a colonoscopy in 2020, and then I had one in 2025. And the first thing my gastroenterologist said was, what are you doing differently now than you were 5 years ago? Because he was comparing my study from 2020 to the one that he just did. Different city, different gastroenterologist. I said, I really got serious about fiber. He said, keep it up. He's like, you look great. And so being able to compare objectively a study from 2020 versus 2025, I think fiber becomes a larger part of the conversation. Now, beyond that, I'm like brightly pigmented fruits and vegetables, really important. Those bright pigments are full of polyphenols, which is a fancy way of saying these are signaling molecules. Remember, we talked about the messengers in the body. So, whether it's radicchio or peppers, just making sure you're trying new types of foods. I think that, there's one particular signaling molecule called urolithin A that's a postbiotic that is really important. And about 30% of us can't produce it on our own. I think it's only 30% of us that can. So the rest of us can't. And testing for it's silly because it's expensive. So more often than not, urolithin A becomes really important. And you can get that in like pomegranates and strawberries and walnuts, but you'd have to eat a lot. So this is some place where I think supplementation can be helpful in particular.
Gotcha. Okay. The F word. I love it.
Yeah, I keep saying, like, I've had people tell me, I'd love to have you on as a guest, but we can't talk about fiber. Seriously.
That's crazy. Wow. No, that's crazy. It's so interesting. I love when things are really black and white and we don't need to discuss them very much. There's not a lot of nuance. And so in the carnivore space where I've been for the last 7 years, it's like, oh, fiber's bad. You can't have fiber. It's the worst thing for you. Think about all the plant toxins that you get when you also get the fiber and the lectins and the oxalate and all the things. And what you're explaining is so much more nuanced. It's not so clean. And even just like considering the different types of fiber, maybe you won't do really well with one, but you'll do better with another. I had never really considered. So it's really interesting, maybe triggering when I'm listening to your amazing guests on your show and you're talking about it. And like, no, we're calling this the longevity molecule. And it's like, but I thought this was like the worst thing for me. So it's interesting that there's a lot of nuance there for somebody who is in the carnivore space. They don't have any, whether or not they're interested in getting more or not. How do you recommend that they start to introduce that?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Casey. And I think I shared transparently, I was full carnivore for 9 months. I tolerated zero fiber. Like if I ate it, it gave me diarrhea and it was really unpleasant. And my surgeon and my gastroenterologist were like, this is just part of the process. I was like, it's because you've decimated my gut microbiome and now my body's trying to rebuild it. So when someone says to me they don't tolerate oxalates, saponins, any of these plant defenses, I'm like, it is probably a reflection of what's going on in your gut. And that's okay because that can change. This is not a static issue. This is something we can change over time. So when someone says to me, my gut's so inflamed, if I introduce any type of fibrous entity, I get gas, bloating, etc. So I'm like, first of all, is it quantity related? What ends up happening is we see a number of like, oh, I track my macros, I'm consuming 10 grams of fiber. Cynthia's saying we have to be consuming 25 or 30. Oh my God, they eat a huge quantity of, let's say it's lentils or beans or flax and chia seeds, and then they have all this bloating. Some of it is dependent on quantity. Sometimes it's dependent on the type. So I will give you an example. I don't really eat junk food, but I do like dark chocolate. And dark chocolate has lots of polyphenols, so there's some health benefits. Occasionally, I will allow myself to have Lily's dark chocolate. Do you know what's in Lily's dark chocolate? Inulin. It does not matter how much or how little I eat, it bloats the hell out of me. So if I eat it, I know what's going to happen. So for me, inulin is not a great choice for me, but I can use flax and chia seeds. I do fine with a small amount of lentils, small amount of beans. I do fine with different types of other plant varieties, hearts of palm, artichoke hearts. So for me, it's finding what works for me. And for everyone listening, it's dial back on the quantity, try a couple things, find one that you like flax and chia seeds for me. Duck to water, do great. They're in all my smoothies. I have one smoothie a day just to buffer my protein intake. No problems whatsoever. My husband even takes it now too. And he and I were laughing. We're like, I cannot believe we are now middle aged and we talk about fiber intake. But yes, that's what we do. So I would say for anyone listening that has concerns about fiber, don't eat a lot of it. Just experiment. Track it to find out where you are. Experiment with a few different kinds. I would avoid like the fermentable stuff. I would not be I wouldn't be taking the supplement powders like inulin or PHGG, which is partially hydrogenated guar gum, which is quite a mouthful. I would probably try some food-based sources. Maybe you start with a tablespoon. That's not a lot. Or if you're really concerned, start with a teaspoon of something and see how you do. But that fiber piece is so important for the colonocytes. I mean, it's a main, kind of like fuel source. This is an important entity to feed those colonocytes, which are the cells in the colon. Um, but I would say experiment and be open-minded. And it takes time. Like 2019, my gut was a disaster. 2020, it was getting better. 2022, it was getting better. I feel like in 2026, I mean, now we're 7 years ahead. Now, maybe the last year and a half, I feel like I'm a master of my domain. I can like figure out what works well. And just like I mentioned, inulin is never going to be my friend personally, never going to be my friend. But there's plenty of other options that I do really well with. And I try to, rotate. Like I am going through a broccoli preoccupation right now, broccoli, asparagus, cauliflower. I don't know why. I go through stages where there's certain vegetables I want to eat a lot of. And then, I might get bored of that and I'll move on to something else. But I think for each one of us, when someone says to me they do not tolerate any fiber, I'm like, I would be interested to see what's going on in your gut. And I do think that there's evolving research that's certainly suggesting that what a woman's gut looks like, what the gut train looks like in perimenopause is very different than what it looks like in menopause. And then if you add in hormone replacement therapy, it starts to resemble a younger gut. And we're not talking about this as like a younger gut, like it looks better. No, we actually see a reduction in inflammation. We see those keystone species coming back. We start seeing less leaky gut. And so I think that the carnivore debate to me really speaks to something insulted the gut. The question is, what it was it? It might not even be important, like what was it? It's how can we slowly build back resilience? Because what we're really speaking to, if you need to be on a long-term elimination diet, there's more work to do. It's just not eliminating the foods. When we start cutting out whole food groups, I genuinely get concerned. Long term, like if it's short term, that's one thing, but long term, I start to get genuinely concerned.
I've started to hear that answer more and more. So that's quite interesting. And I think the way you approach it is really very reasonable.
Mhm.
I've always really loved the definition of quote unquote carnivore as a hyper
Mhm.
carnivore in nature consumes 75% or more of their calories from animal products. That leaves a lot of wiggle room that we don't have to fight about certain things. So I think it's really nuanced. I really like your approach. Was it uncomfortable for you after 9 months to have Sean Baker show up at your house and try to like bust in and tear up your carnivore card?
No, no. I mean, I think for any of us, and Sean is so reasonable that I think Sometimes I feel like it's the health and wellness space that gets rigid. Like people say, wait a minute, you used to talk about fasting, what's going on? Or you used to talk about low carb, what's going on? I'm like, to me personally, the sign of an intelligent person is that they change their mind. It doesn't mean that you have to change your mind about nutrition per se, but like understand that, know better, do better. Like I always apologize for the fact that I used to tell people not to eat butter. But that was in the early 2000s when that was like the conventional nutrition advice we gave all of our patients. And I cringe and I apologize for that. But now I know better. And so we want to be evolving. If you're not changing your mind, even if it's just a nuanced approach, then I start thinking that you're not staying like current in either in the literature or with your understanding that there's not a one size fits all for everybody. Like Casey, if you were to say, what should every woman be eating? I would say, well, people probably need to eat more protein. They probably need a little bit more fiber and they probably need to drink more water. Like that's a generality, but every person listening might need a little bit more or a little bit less, depending on, who they are and how physically active they are and how their gut reacts to foods that they eat. Like I tell everyone transparently, I do better with lean protein, higher carb, lower fat diet. That's what works for me. And I encourage everyone to figure out what works best for you, within some guardrails. Like we don't want you to go out and eat 80% of your diet from ultra processed foods because we know that's not going to be particularly helpful. But I find that kind of approach of try out the fattier meats. If you do better, I'm great. Then you need to not consume half an avocado with every meal. You probably need to like buffer your other fats in your diet. So I think for every one of us, it's figuring out like the power of the N of one.
Yeah, I love that. Like I said, I think that's totally reasonable. So I really appreciate you going there. I wanted to, you write about all kinds of lifestyle modifications that people can make in your book. I wanted to make sure that we left time for hormone replacement therapy. I hope we've covered this enough on our show, and I hope most of the listeners understand that whatever information we've heard about hormone replacement therapy in the last 20 to 25 years is probably all bogus and is not based on good science. But just in case, can you talk about why hormone replacement therapy is not this boogeyman that people said it was, and where it can be helpful and how people should consider approaching that?
Yeah, in the Menopause Gut, I actually unpacked the Women's Health Initiative, which came out in 2002, which is when I was a fairly new nurse practitioner. So, in the wake of that study, which was not properly interpreted, what came out of that was the message was hormones are bad, hormones will cause cancer. And so we have an entire generation of clinicians that didn't learn how to prescribe them. And we have an entire generation, it's the boomers, my mother's generation, that we're fearful to take hormones. So when I look at the study itself, there are limitations. They used predominantly an older, less healthy population. So women that were 10 plus years into menopause, that had pre-existing history of smoking, had high blood pressure. They weren't metabolically healthy people. That one arm was put on Premarin, which is pregnant mare's urine, so it's synthetic estrogen. And then another arm was put on Premarin, again, synthetic estrogen, and methyl medroxy, so it's MPA, so it's a progestin. So it's a type of synthetic progesterone, so not body identical hormones. In one of those groups, it showed that there was an increased risk of cancer, but they kind of took things out of context. And so I remind people all the time, there was some valuable information that came out of that study, but overall, what was taken out of it was hormones cause cancer, therefore don't use hormones. And so when the research was re-examined, even the North American Menopause Society came out with a position statement a few years ago saying, the way that information was interpreted, we think has potentially been problematic. And this is now what the consensus statement is. So now we acknowledge that hormones actually, if we replace what we're losing, can actually be beneficial. Very clear on bone protection. So estradiol is primary prevention for osteoporosis, very protective for heart disease. And heart disease is the number one killer of women. 1 in 3 women will die of heart disease. So really, really serious. Protective for heart disease. Plus or minus, we're looking at brain health. We're extrapolating that if we remain insulin sensitive, we will probably be protected from some of the neurocognitive decline that we see with Alzheimer's, dementia, and other types of neurocognitive disorders. Evolving research on the gut microbiome. There's research on vaginal health being very beneficial, replacing hormones. I think one of the most common reasons women get admitted to the hospital is for a urinary tract infection. If it gets in the bloodstream, it's called sepsis. Sepsis is what lands little old ladies and little old men in ICUs and sometimes kills them. But using vaginal estrogen can decrease hospitalizations, I think by 70%. So pretty like unbelievable reduction in hospitalizations. And then not to mention what it does, in terms of collagen, elastin, improving skin quality. So I think most women benefit from replacement of estrogen and then progesterone, both body identical. About 25% of women still make enough testosterone, but not everyone does. And so testosterone replacement, we're waiting for FDA approval. It's completely criminal that we don't have it for women. Right now, the only FDA indication is for hypoactive sexual desire disorder called HSDD, which is bizarre to me that we know that testosterone does more than help libido. It's helpful for executive function, helpful for building muscle mass. And so there's many other kind of indications. And then, looking at it beyond that, there's other hormones. Most women need some form of thyroid replacement because women do genuinely go through this kind of endocrine decline in hormones. And replacing the hormones allows women to feel a whole lot better, improves their sleep, improves their mood, energy levels. I mean, at the basis of aging is mitochondrial dysfunction, which is a kind of a separate topic. But I do fervently believe that women should all be counseled on hormone replacement therapy. And I would say the same thing for men. The number one and two reasons for why men have low testosterone right now is exposure to endocrine mimicking chemicals. Number two is insulin resistance. So definitely like at an epidemic for men as well. And I always say that, unfortunately, traditional allopathic medicine waits for men to get really low in testosterone before they think that they need to replace it. But the more I have conversations with colleagues that are working directly with men in longevity centers, talking about the benefits. And again, it's not just a sex hormone. It is, helpful for executive function and motivation and mood and so many other things, bone health. Testosterone is also an immune modulator. So there's a lot to the conversation, and I'm so glad that you're bringing it up. But everyone listening should have a fully informed conversation with their prescriber so they can decide if it's the right decision for them. But I can tell you on an intake form, I know which women are taking hormone replacement therapy because they're generally feeling a whole lot better.
Okay, I only hear upside. I only hear benefit. And any of the women that I work with who do it, they absolutely love it. They would stab me in the neck if I tried to take it away from them. What is the contraindication? Who should not be on replacement therapy?
I mean, there are people that you have to be cautious around. If they have a blood clotting disorder, if they've got an active pulmonary embolus, which is a blood clot in the lungs, or an active blood clot in the legs, which can deep vein thrombosis. Some of the cancer diagnoses, so like active cancer, someone who's currently being treated, probably not ideal. But I think in most other instances, it's part of the conversation. Even breast cancer survivors can be prescribed hormone replacement therapy. I have actually Dr. Corinne Men is a breast cancer survivor. She's also a GYN. I think about her as the foremost expert in this area. And she is someone that takes hormone replacement therapy, prescribes it for people who are finished with treatment for GYN related cancers or breast cancers. And I think we're starting to turn the tide. I think many, many women, I have a woman on my team who I love dearly, who's a breast cancer thriver. And it's been frustrating for her to try to get someone to address being kept in such a low estrogen state, because what happens with a lot of these breast cancer treatment patients, they effectively are given aromatase inhibitors, which plummets what little estrogen they still have. And then they get all the sequelae. They get bone pain. They have significant vaginal symptoms. They have brain fog. They have body composition changes. And so I think that we need to get back to like a more humane way of practicing and just being, having a conversation. Like many of these patients have been treated for cancer. If they were given the option of restarting hormones to feel better, they would be willing to take that chance, provided that they're being monitored appropriately and there's ongoing support and feedback. But I think to say that women, the argument I sometimes hear, Casey, that I find astounding, sometimes said by licensed medical providers, let me just put that dovetail in there, is that, oh, if women were meant to continue having higher levels of hormones, they wouldn't live so long. Or, this is natural. Menopause is natural. If you live long enough, you will go into menopause. That is correct. But it's not natural not to sleep. It's not natural to have your bones break down. It's not natural to not be able to think straight. It's not natural to not be able to sleep. It's not natural not to be able to have sex. I mean, I think about like, I hear that and I'm like, okay, I want to be respectful, but that's equally fear mongering as, the other side can be. And so everyone deserves to have the conversation. And then they can decide to change their mind later too, right? If someone says, I want to do this naturally, I think that's great. I've had people on my podcast occasionally that will tell me that. And a few years later, they're like, nope, can't do that. I can't sleep. I feel like I'm losing my mind. My body composition's changed drastically. I mean, nothing is more frustrating for a woman who's, never had a weight problem before to hit those perimenopause, menopause years and be told that, there's nothing we can do. Just exercise more and eat less. It's like some of my patients were eating like 600 calories a day. It wasn't that
Oh my gosh.
they wanted to, eat that little. It's that they just get to a point where their metabolism is just so busted that they need help. And
Wow.
none of us should judge anyone for that.
Wow. Well, thank you for all of that. What is one favorite part of your book that we didn't get to talk about today?
Oh, I would say I think it's really significant, and the research is evolving in the area of adverse childhood events. So this was a joint venture between Kaiser Permanente and the CDC. There are online quizzes that you can take. They're pretty short. But if you have a high ACE score, you are more likely to develop autoimmune conditions, have a disordered relationship with food, more body composition, poor metabolic health, and then also it will age your ovaries faster than someone who didn't grow up with that amount of stress and chronic cortisol activation. So I think that to me is a really interesting and evolving area in medicine, the complex interrelationship of chronic autonomic nervous system dysfunction because of someone's nervous system growing up in an environment where they didn't feel safe. And let me back up and say there's big T trauma. I think all of us know that suicide, rape, murder. I mean, obviously horrific things. But little t trauma is sometimes a little more insidious. It's sometimes not talked about as much. Abuse, addiction, things you're exposed to as a child, not feeling like you're being neglected, for a lot of people can really impact their safety. And so if you don't feel safe in your body can react accordingly. But the research evolving around earlier menopause, I think, is really, really interesting.
Wow. Well, that's amazing that we're getting more research on that because I agree. I think we maybe don't talk about the little t trauma enough, but it's all relative to somebody's life. Like if you weren't exposed to, some of the heavy things, but the lighter things may have the same effect on you, even though like relatively they're a little bit different. So I love that. This has been an amazing conversation, Cynthia. I always enjoy spending time with you. I think I know how hard you work, but you probably work a lot harder than any of us suppose. You're working very hard to get amazing information out, and just can't thank you enough for everything that you do. So for now, where can people go to find you and connect with you and your work? And where can people find the book?
Thank you so much, Casey. Always a pleasure to connect with you. So probably easiest to go to my website, www.cynthiathurlow.com. You can pre-order the Menopause Gut there. I always tell people if you have a brick and mortar bookstore, please try to give them your business. But Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, Target are all carrying it. I'm active across social media. I am particularly interested right now in Substack. I've been actively growing that community. In fact, this past week, I published 2 articles that anyone that wants to get to know me better as a person and how that's impacted my health and the trajectory of me as an individual. And I talk about my adverse childhood events and childhood trauma in a very non-triggering way, just objectively talking about how that has influenced me as a person. But I'm active across social media. And if you listen to me on Casey's podcast, please reach out to me. I generally am the person that's responding to DMs across social. I haven't been able to like give that up entirely to my team yet. And I say that because I genuinely want to know what people are interested in, what their questions are, how I can help them. And my podcast, Everyday Wellness, is, as I mentioned, probably one of my favorite things I do in my business. It's really a passion project. And I try to make it as helpful as I can. Midlife Minutes are our Friday that you were mentioning, kind of shorter podcast that I'm doing solo. I'm just literally answering listeners' questions, like 1 or 2 questions every week. And it's been really well received. People are like, oh, I love to just hear you talk sometimes. My family's always like, oh boy, here we go. But it really an honor to connect with you again.
It's awesome. Well, thank you so very much for being on our show today. We'll make sure that all of that is linked up so people can find it. And yeah, it's always great to learn from you. So thank you so very much for taking time out of your busy life to come on our show today. We really appreciate you.
Thanks, Casey.
Thanks, Cynthia. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.